I'm Suzanne Spellen, and I live here in Troy, New York. I'm an author, a historic preservationist, and a writer. And my specialties are Brooklyn, where I came from, and also now Troy, especially African American history in both places. You're listening to Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City.
Hello, and welcome to Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City, where we explore the history and people of Troy, New York, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, John Salka. We're joined today by Suzanne Spellen, local historian, writer, researcher, to discuss one of Troy's most well-known Black citizens, Garnet Douglass Baltimore. Suzanne has written and researched extensively on Mr. Baltimore for her Substack, Spellen of Troy, and was recently a featured lecturer at the Lansingburgh Historical Society to discuss Mr. Baltimore's extensive contribution to Troy during his lifetime. Thank you, Suzanne, for being here to share your knowledge about this important figure in Troy history.
Well, I'm very glad to, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, this has been really great. I know we've been literally trying to get this interview scheduled for I don't even know how long now, but I'm glad we were able to finally get you on the show.
Very happy to be here.
So, for those unfamiliar with Garnet Douglass Baltimore, can you give us a quick snapshot of who he is?
Sure. Garnet Douglass Baltimore was born in 1859 here in Troy. His parents lived here. His father, Peter Baltimore, had a very successful barbershop, and that was very important during the Underground Railroad days, which maybe we'll get into later. He had three siblings, and he and his brother were educated in the segregated Black school that Troy had. And after a while, they got tired of being there. Their white teachers were not letting them advance as much as they could. So they applied to the Troy Academy, which was the elite white school here in Troy. And they both were admitted and were the first Black students at that institution. He then went on to become the first Black student to be admitted to RPI. And he was very successful there and became a graduate in 1881. We're going to have to edit some of this. And he was one of 17 remaining students who graduated from that class. The next day after graduation, he ended up getting a job with the railroad system. And that was just the beginning of a very long, very varied employment throughout his life, and he ended up back in Troy, and that's where the bulk of his story takes place.
Your Substack, Spellen of Troy, has a very substantial and detailed post of not about just his story, but his family's story. I know you touched on it a little bit, but can you explain how the Baltimore family came to Troy in the first place and their place in Troy's history?
Well, his grandparents, who were Samuel and Phoebe Baltimore, they were both free people. They came from New England somewhere, and they moved to Troy in the early 1800s. And they had what they called an oyster cellar, Cellar, and that was an oysters restaurant. And it was very successful, very popular. And when Samuel died, his son had to have an occupation, and he became a barber. And being a barber was a very important and very special kind of occupation for a Black man at that time. And one thing we do have is a portrait of him that the Hart Cluett Museum has that shows him as a young man. And it's one of the very few portraits of a Black man in existence. And Hart Cluett went through a lot of trouble, time, and money to get this, and it's now a very valuable part of their collection. But anyway, Peter was working in his barbershop, which was on First Street, where all the banks and the big insurance companies are. And he was the barber for the rich and all the rich men, the bankers, the businessmen who were working and trading on that street. And little did they know when they went into his shop that they were going to be given some great conversation, a great shave, a great whatever. But while they were getting all of that done, Peter Baltimore was running an underground railroad stop right there. Sometimes the unknown, unseen Black person who was sweeping up after him was really someone who was a fugitive and on his way to freedom. So he ran this right under everybody's noses. He was very intelligent and he was able to have conversations with all of these wealthy people, find out what was going on, find out how they felt about things like slavery and abolition. And he was an incredibly valuable part of the abolitionist movement in Troy.
What about Garnet's mother? What do we know much about her?
We really don't, unfortunately. And I wish we did. There's so much more research that needs to be done. I don't know how much is actually available because records are shaky, and unfortunately, as far as the Baltimore family goes, Garnet didn't have any children, and the family has sort of thinned out. I think there are a few relatives still in the area, but there were no papers left, no journals, no, sitting the grandkids on their knee and telling them stories. There's none of that. So we really have to piece together much of his life from what still exists, which are his works, basically.
We had Joe Moses on the show last year, and his father was the first Black police officer in city of Troy's history. And he talked a little bit about the difficulties or the challenges of Black Americans knowing their past, because there reaches a certain point where prior generations, records just simply don't exist, obviously, due to slavery or relocation of people, whether they left the South or they became free persons from being slaves. And I found that really compelling. And here we have a similar connection where we have an underground railroad location at this barbershop, which was owned by the father of the first Black RPI graduate and one of the most well-known, probably at the time, figures of Troy. Is that particularly compelling for you when you kind of look at the broader tapestry of sort of like Troy's history and their place in it?
Absolutely fascinated by it. Just imagining what it must have been like to be doing that. I mean, what he was doing was totally illegal. Very analogous to what's going on now with refugees and things. He was breaking federal law, and he felt that he had a moral responsibility to do this, and he did it. And nobody ever either never found out until afterwards, or didn't or knew about it and wink wink went about their business. So I don't know if we'll ever be able to find out. I have to admit that I have to do so much more research. I just haven't had the opportunity. I need to go over to Hart Cluett and haunt them for a couple of weeks and just go through everything. And I really, just haven't had a chance to do that.
When I was reading your blog, your Substack, I was amazed at how significant his work was across New York State, his time with the State Canal Corporation, and then later working for the city of Troy, all during an era when racism and discrimination was still the dominant force in America, whether it was his work designing portions of Oakwood Cemetery and then later, obviously, Prospect Park in Troy. I was especially surprised at how little of his work was implemented at Prospect Park before the park actually opened to the public. What was the most surprising thing you found as you took a closer look at his life?
Regarding the park, he didn't have any trouble getting the job. They wanted him to do it because before that he had been doing so many cemeteries and other jobs that they really knew he was competent and could do his job well. And Troy was so Troy, in putting this together, because there were arguments and disagreements and fights over where to put the park, and it ended up being on the Warren estate, and how much were the Warrens getting, and how come they got to get it, and all kinds of the usual stuff. But he just wanted to design a great park, and he went around the country, went to Boston and Philadelphia and New York and Brooklyn to look at Prospect Park in Brooklyn and Central Park and all the other parks to get ideas about what he could put in our park. And he came back with all these wonderful ideas, and he probably drew them up and everything. And the city kind of said, "Oh, that's nice." Well, it costs what? And they basically did their own thing. And he got to do much of what he wanted to do, but not in the order that he wanted it done, because they wanted to open the park and they didn't care if what he was doing was completed or not. They wanted to open the park, and so they did, which actually made him quite upset because a lot of the things that he wanted to do weren't completed yet, and it took another 10-15 years for them to actually complete all of the things that they put in the park at that time. So I would imagine, and he cared for the park the rest of his life. He was always going up there, and unfortunately, as time went on, the park started to deteriorate, and not a lot of money was spent on it, and the things that he really loved about it, one by one, disappeared, and he was very upset about that.
Is there anything that's still in the park today, Prospect Park? Do you know that is sort of a remnant of the work that he did, or is most of that layout, is most of those things, have those sort of been washed away by the passage of time?
I don't, I may be wrong, but I don't think any of the structures that he put in there are still there. I think the general pathways and meadows and the physical part of the park is as he designed it. Maybe a little change here and there, but basically, if you go up there and drive around or walk around, that's his park. It's just that, the fountains and the small buildings and the observatory and all that other stuff, they're gone.
If we could take a step back, obviously, um, RPI has made a big to-do about celebrating Garnet Baltimore's, excuse me, Garnet Douglass Baltimore's life as the first black graduate. That was a pretty significant deal at the time, as I alluded to sort of earlier. This was still in what would be the 1800s, right?
Yeah, 1881 was when he graduated.
I mean,
So,
that's a pretty incredible thing to
yeah,
consider, that the Civil War ended in 1865, and here it is 1881, and he's graduating from one of the most prestigious engineering schools in the country.
yeah, it's pretty impressive. Um, and also that here was a man who was named after two of the abolitionist movement's greatest people, Highland, Henry Highland Garnet and Frederick Douglass. And of course, everyone knows who Frederick Douglass was. And Henry Highland Garnet was a pastor at Liberty Baptist Colored Baptist Church here in Troy, and he was a firebrand. He was one of the great orators, and he eventually ended up in Washington D.C. and New York City. And his parents were so impressed by both of them that they named him Garnet Douglass Baltimore, which I don't see how very many people who were aware of anything could have, just called him out, yo, Garnet, and not known who Garnet was named after. So that's pretty amazing as well.
What do we know about his time from RPI? Is it sort of just lost? Again, it's something similar to the park. Is it just kind of like lost with the passage of time, or are there little bits and pieces of his time there that we can kind of look back on?
I'm not sure. I asked someone up there, and they said that they didn't really have much of anything. They don't have any of his student papers or anything other than the record that he was actually there. Unfortunately, that's the story of his story. There's just not a lot of stuff that he left behind in terms of paper or, you know, records.
Sure. And actually, that leads me to my next question because on your Substack, you said his life is an enigma due to the lack of published interviews or even personal writings. As a historian and as someone who's studied him closer in the process of continuing to research his life, do you think that's critical to fully understand a person from such a distant historical perspective? He died 80, almost 80 years ago, if not longer. Um, and oftentimes, we see news stories, reports. They say, "Oh my gosh, someone's private journal was uncovered," and it gives them new insights into their life at that period. So, do you think that would be more helpful for us to fully understand him and his place in Troy's broader story?
Yeah, definitely. It's really frustrating that there isn't anything. Um, and there's no one alive now who knew him. He died in the late 40s. And so, he's an enigma. And you sort of have to piece his life together from what little there is when he was written about in the papers or looking at his designs for Oakwood, for example, and the other projects that he had. We do know that when he was working for the canal system, the museum in Syracuse, the Erie Canal Museum, has very little on him as well, but they do have one record that shows how much he got paid for a project. And he was making more money than almost everyone else. There was only one person ahead of him who was, I guess, his boss, but he was making the second highest salary. So it's just amazing that this black man who was not hiding the fact that he was black, he looked like a black man, and very handsome one too. And he was there doing his thing, and they accepted it. I'm always amazed at that.
His own story, you said he didn't have any children, and but he did spend some time on Long Island doing some work as part of his career, and that's how he met his wife, correct?
That's correct. He was down in on Long Island working on the Shinnecock Canal, and he met his wife to be. I think he met her in church or some, related to the church that he was going to. And she was white. And, you know, one of the few times they actually dated for about 3 years. And he finally asked, he was back up here in Troy and he asked her to marry him and she accepted. And the newspapers picked up this story. This is one of the few times he was making the newspapers that had nothing to do with, his work, and they were saying, love transcends race, and she was some kind of town belle of the ball, and from an important family, and they got married, and they were just marveling at it. It was really ridiculous, but and it got syndicated and was carried quite a few places outside of the state, even, that this black man had married this white woman, and both sides of the family were very much for it, and they were just gobsmacked.
The city of Troy and RPI have obviously done a lot to highlight Garnet Douglass Baltimore and his connection to the city and the university. Uh, I'm sure you remember, but during my time working for the mayor, we restored that long overgrown lost walking trail that connected Troy's Little Italy neighborhood to the back of Prospect Park, where the old pool is. And that was a small project spearheaded by then Commissioner Steve Strikeman. who's another RPI grad, by the way. And we later dedicated the trail to Garnet Douglass Baltimore in honor of his connection to helping design the park. Um, how important are dedications to lesser known figures in Troy's history when we talk about sort of looking at the broader arc and you sort of see oh, it's always Uncle Sam, but to be able to say, right, actually, this dedication is for this particular person and helping elevate their profile so that more people come to know who they are.
I think it's really important. I think after first the road was the street that he lived on was named after him, and then later on the trail, and reporters started writing about him for a hot minute. You know, who was he? What did he do? Why did they name this after him? And so that kind of thing always brings him back into the public light and gives me a great opportunity to be able to tell his story here, there, and everywhere. And I guess I'm kind of used to that because in New York they name streets after people all the time, and that helps those people get noticed and celebrated. So I think it's a very important and very easy thing to do is to rename a street or put up a trail and name it after him so that his name is on people's lips even if they're not quite sure who he was or what he did.
I wanted to turn to you for a little bit, and you've obviously been deeply involved in Troy civic life, local government for quite a bit. Um, when you think about your relationship to history and research, is there a connection between the two of those things?
Well, when I came up here in 2012, the first time I had never been to Troy before, didn't know a soul here. And the first time I drove into Troy, I was like, I can live here. This place is gorgeous. It's got history. It's got great architecture. We're in. And I've loved it ever since. And I immediately started finding out about first the big monuments and things like that. I got some of Don Rittner's books and found out all I could about things and became friends with the people down at what was the Rensselaer Historical Society. And Kathy Sheen's great, went on some tours. So I just did everything I could. As far as research, Brooklyn is so much easier because there's so much more online. Troy, there aren't too many things that I can find online, and I have to go to a national newspaper site in order to get articles from all of Troy's many, many daily newspapers. And so there is stuff out there, and I found a lot of things, but it's not as easy as in Brooklyn, which is the challenge is actually kind of fun to see what you can find out without the ease of 6, 7 different sites that I can check in Brooklyn.
Your post on your Substack begins with the line, quote, "We shouldn't have to wait for Black History Month to highlight important men and women who made American history," unquote. Um, we're sort of living through an era where the federal government or the people in charge of the federal government are sort of fixated on downplaying, if not like in some cases erasing the contributions of Black people, Black Americans. And we touched on this briefly, but why is it so important to ensure that the full spectrum of American history, including historically marginalized people and marginalized voices, marginalized perspectives, is documented and more importantly, remembered?
Because it's all in terms of American history, it's all American history. We're all supposed to be Americans. And so the things that have made us over the centuries, no matter what group you're in, are all part of what makes you an American and what makes the city you live in, the state you live in, what it is. It's incomprehensible how they can think that mentioning Harriet Tubman is somehow wrong when she was one of the great people in this country's history. I I get absolutely flummoxed, and you really don't want to hear my political opinions of this, but it's just wrong. And I'm hoping that, as time goes by, and I guess we'll have to wait to another administration, that things go back to normal, or at least, you know, they want to shut down practically the African American Museum in Washington, the Smithsonian Museum, or at least whitewash it to the point that slavery becomes a job or something like that. I mean, that's insane.
Important vocational training, right? Or something.
Yeah, yeah. They're so much better off because they were enslaved, because they got to learn, to be American or some silly stupidness like that. It's just not right. It's not correct. It's wrong. And we shouldn't have to go through this. It's ridiculous.
So I just wanted to close perhaps on a lighter note, and this is something that we ask all of our guests, and that is, how do you enjoy Troy?
I love Troy. Like I said, first time I drove in, crossed the bridge, I was like, yeah, I can live here. And as I settled in, my friend and I moved here together. She bought a two-family house. I live on top. I live on the bottom floor. She lives in the top apartment. And we didn't know anyone. And it didn't take long to start to get to know people. Everyone was wonderfully friendly. And we lucked out on so many different things as far as renovation and all that kind of stuff. So after we got settled a bit, I just started meeting people who were interested in the same things I was interested in. And I actually had a bit of a reputation that some people had heard of me already. And so that introduced me to other people who introduced me to other people. And I ended up being on several boards. And I was a Troy City Planning Commissioner for 3 years. And I'm on the board of Oakwood Cemetery, so I got to see a lot of Garnet Douglass Baltimore's work in that cemetery. And in fact, we had an RPI tour, a bus tour of the cemetery last month, and we showed people where he's buried and what parts of the cemetery he did, as well as we went around and saw RPI presidents' graves and all kinds of other stuff. So I'm on the board of the Gateway, Hudson Mohawk Industrial Gateway, and I'm vice chair of the Troy Community Land Bank. So I've jumped into Troy feet first, and I just love it because, here you can make a difference. Coming from somewhere like New York City, where there's just so many people, and you just get lost in the horde, even if you're involved in community things. It's just too many people. But here you do something and you can see what the results are, and you're appreciated or hated depending on what you're doing. And and it's great. And I love that. I grew up near Oneonta in Otsego County. So I'm used to country. I'm used to seeing cows in the pasture. And it's great about Troy is that 5 minutes outside of the city limits, you can see cows in the pasture. You can go, but you come back to a real city with real city good things and bad things. And there's so much culture around and history. There's Albany. You can go out to Cooperstown. There's just all kinds of stuff around, and it's just the best of all worlds as far as I'm concerned.
One of the big things that Troy is known most for is the Troy Farmers Market. Do you get a chance to go to the farmers market at all during on Saturdays? And if so, what are your favorite vendors?
You know what? I don't go that often. I do a lot of walking tours in Brooklyn on the weekends. So half the time I'm on the train going down there, and by the time I come up, it's night. So I try to get there every once in a while, but I'm not there enough to have a favorite vendor, unfortunately. But when I do go, I always say, why am I not here more often? This is wonderful. But I need to be cloned, so there's just not enough time.
Is there an interesting Garnet Douglass Baltimore story you want to sort of end with before we go?
Sure. Later in his life, when he was in his 70s and his 80s, he was still working. He was a workaholic. And there are tales that he used to walk around Troy and just be pleasant to everyone he met and was really, well loved. And ironically, one of the projects he was doing in his late 70s, early 80s was working on new developments in Troy's housing. And this was, in the 20s and early 30s. And he was developing the houses that are up near RPI, the sort of suburban colonial revivals and the bungalows that are around Freer Park and RPI. And ironically, he laid out, they were using his maps that he did for Troy when he was working for city planning. And he helped them on some other stuff. But after they built the houses, he couldn't live there because they were segregated. So it's just a great irony that, this man, this great man, would not have been, all these properties were restricted, and there are ads that say, the finest restrictions, blah blah blah. They didn't spell them out, but that's what it always meant. And he did all this work for these people, and he couldn't have bought a house there. It's, I think that was one of the things that maybe hopefully got him down and realized that, his golden life had a lot of things in it that were not very nice. And but he still loved Troy to the day he died, and Troy loved him, because after he died, they had a front page obituary in the paper and his picture, and they talked about him, and they said he was the finest man in Troy, and he, they just praised him to the heavens. So his life is still just so amazing because of all the contradictions and the accomplishments. And I hope to be able to find out much, much more about him as time goes by. Just need a big grant so so I don't have to, do the 9 to 5. But I hope to be able to find out much more, and hopefully, if I'm fortunate, maybe squeeze a book out of it, because I think it needs to be written.
Where can people find you online, your Substack, Spellen of Troy? Is there a particular place people can go?
Yeah, it's Suzanne Spellen. So it's Suzanne. S is in Sam, P is in Peter, Ellen is in Nancy, .substack.com. And my page is called Spellen of Troy. So if you Google that, you might get my old blog that I don't post on anymore. So go to Substack. And also I write a monthly column for brownstoner.com that's in Brooklyn. And, here, there, and everywhere whenever I can.
Suzanne, thank you so much for doing this. I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to talk with me. And thank you for being so tenacious and receptive to doing this interview and finally getting it scheduled.
Yeah, the technology hates me, so I'm glad that we've managed to thwart technology and get this done. It's been a pleasure.